Welcome to Dear Diaspora, a podcast celebrating the African diaspora and the changemakers, innovators, and entrepreneurs working to make our world a better one to live in. I'm your host, Kowa. Let's get started. So before I introduce the next guest, don't forget to leave a review, subscribe, and rate on Apple Podcasts. It makes a huge difference, and one key way that it does that is people are more likely to check out an episode or two if they see that there are ratings and if they see that people are actually listening to the content and enjoying the content. And one way to show that you enjoy the content is by leaving a review. So for everyone that's left a review, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And if you are listening on any other podcast listening platform, please make sure you follow the podcast so you're notified each Sunday when new episodes come out. And lastly, if you're listening on Spotify, you can actually share the podcast that you listen to on Instagram stories, just like you would a song. So if you're listening to Dear Diaspora on Spotify, you can share that in your Insta stories and I will repost. So of course, tag Dear Diaspora and I will repost, and really appreciate you spreading the word about the podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in to episode 18 of Dear Diaspora. I am so excited for y'all to listen to this conversation. I had such a great chat with the founder of Africlick. So Africlick is a new dating and networking app for ambitious professionals and creatives of African and Caribbean heritage. Whether you're based in London, Lagos, Harare, or Houston, their mission is to empower you to connect to your culture. So if you want to learn more about Africlick and pre-register for the app, you can go to Africlick.com. Dayo Akinrade is the founder of Africlick. She holds a bachelor's degree in computer science from the University of Manchester and a master's in technology entrepreneurship from University College London. She's spent over 10 years working in IT management consulting, and as you would imagine, her job required a lot of travel and sometimes had her, staying in hotels for up to 6 months at a time. And so as she navigated balancing work, travel, and trying to meet new people, something dawned on her. Dating and meeting new people was hard, especially when thinking about how you can connect with people from similar cultural backgrounds. So after using, your traditional dating apps like Tinder and things, she didn't have the best experience, and she thought to herself, there has to be a better way for Black people to meet, network, date, mingle, all the things. And Africlick was born. I personally can't wait for Africlick to be available like everywhere. I'm new to Kansas City, as most of you know, and I immediately thought to myself when I moved here, like, how do I easily just meet people with similar backgrounds, similar interests, just with similar values? Like, there's not a place you can really do that, outside of, meeting people and going to events and things like that. And so I would love an easy way to do that, just on my phone. And I can't wait for this to exist in Kansas City. And so if you are out there in a city where Africlick is available, I'd love to hear your feedback and, hear how the platform has, helped you meet people from similar cultural backgrounds. And so I just really love this conversation that I had with Dayo. She is an advocate for, diversity in tech, and I love that about her. And I can't wait for y'all to hear more about her and, Africlick and, where she hopes to see it in the next few years. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Dayo Akinrade. Dayo, thank you so much for being a guest on Dear Diaspora. I'm so excited to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm totally excited to be here too.
Yes. And so let's get started by just finding out a bit more about what you're building, Africlick. For those that are not familiar with it, how would you describe what it is and how it's going to work?
Okay, so Africlick in itself, the name is a play on words. It's where Africans click. We fuse the two words together. What we mean by click is, when sometimes two people meet and they just have a great connection, and you kind of say, oh my gosh, we both clicked. It was great. We were talking all evening and we just had like the best time. So, in terms of the product, Africlick, we're a new dating app and we are for ambitious professionals and creatives of African and Caribbean heritage. So, in essence, we're a dating app for people. And as long as you can trace your roots back to somewhere in Africa or somewhere in the Caribbean, we're here basically. And in essence, our mission is to empower us to connect through our culture, meaning that we're, understanding that there's definitely a need and a desire for a lot of us, maybe when we're choosing whether it's who we want to date or our life partner, a lot of the time it's important to us to be with someone who appreciates our culture, understands our culture, and who is from the culture. And yeah, that's in essence what we're enabling to happen. And we're looking at this globally as well. So the way we see it from Africlick, whether you are in London, whether you are in Lagos or Houston or, Zimbabwe, or maybe if you happen to be studying, and us Africans, we study everywhere, right? Like as far flung as Malaysia and China or whatnot. But if you're somewhere in a new city and you're thinking, yeah, I want to connect with someone who's from where I'm from, maybe you want to kind of get comfortable re-speaking your language or going to get food or, play football or dating or whatnot, Africlick should be what you can think about as a way to connect to your culture.
Very, very cool. Thank you for sharing that. And so, is it for people, let's say like 18 and up?
Yes, officially. I mean, the app does have two modes. One is a dating mode, and one is like a networking sort of friendship mode. So you can sort of, when you sign up, depending on which mode you select, you have a slightly different user experience. Because of course, if somebody signs up for dating, there are certain things we want to know in terms of people's hobbies and the music they like. Whether it's kind of like Afro beats, we might be interested in sort of which jollof rice is your kind of correct affiliation. Things like your religion, and also we have built in this concept of what we call a dual location, which I think is, it's very specific to Africans and particularly diaspora, where a lot of us are between two cities. So, for example, my profile would say I'm Dayo and I'm in London, but I'm also from Nigeria. And for me, it's important to have both locations and my heritage. That's like an integral part of my profile. Whereas maybe if I was to make a profile on Tinder, all I can say is Dial from London. It's not taking my sort of like ethnicity and my culture into account.
Oh, wow. That's super interesting. And so, what led you to like creating Africlick? Like, was it based on like your personal experiences, like maybe dating or trying to network with people from like similar cultures, or were you like maybe using Tinder or Bumble or something and were like, this is just not for me? Like, what kind of led you to like creating this?
Pretty much all of the above that you've summarized really well. So prior to creating Africlick, I was working as an IT management consultant, more on the technology side within financial services. So I spent a few years at Accenture and at Deloitte and Touche. So I was very much in that high performance consulting. They would call it a lifestyle where there's a lot of travel involved. So the job is maybe about sometimes maybe 40% travel. And you're kind of away Monday, if you're lucky, Monday to Thursday, because then you can work from your home office on Friday. A lot of the times it's Monday to Friday. So I would kind of be living in hotels for maybe 6 months at a time, sometimes a year at a time. And what that meant was that it was very hard to date, because you would meet someone in London and be like, well, you can only see me Fridays and Saturdays and a little bit of Sunday. And it also made it hard to plan things, because then if you wanted to do something like the theatre or a concert, a lot of these things happen in the weekday, and I was never in London on the weekday. So I was definitely finding it hard to date. And even the times where maybe I was based in London, as is, I think, fairly typical of a lot of diaspora experiences, on a daily basis and even on a weekly basis. And this was in my case where, for me, I was, conscious even looking for somebody who was Nigerian, like me. Um, I wasn't even meeting new Nigerians, because pretty much everyone in my team was white. Pretty much everyone on the floor was white. Maybe the only people of color in the building would be perhaps the security guard, uh, maybe a couple of the executive assistants who are like married and usually female. So I was just beginning to realize that, look, even from a numbers perspective, dating was very difficult, and I was hearing this echoed from both women and men as well. So the only maybe opportunities people were having to meet was church and weddings, but there are not that many weddings. Weddings happen in the summer, and maybe like kind of parties. And a lot of people were saying that, look, once I've exhausted my immediate social circle, my friends, and possibly my friends of friends, there was nothing after that. And so I then, so kind of, yeah, at the time, yes, you always hear about Tinder. So I, downloaded Tinder, started swiping, as you do. First of all, you realize, okay, well, that there's no race filter. So I can't even shortcut to what I know I'm looking for, my preference. So I find I was having to swipe through, and actually it's weird, the way the Tinder algorithm seems to work, and all my friends would joke about this. You'll be swiping through like loads of white guys, then suddenly you'll get like 8 black guys in a row, and then it goes white again. And it's like, we all kind of notice this. So then I also noticed that, well, even if I swiped yes to a black guy, I had no guarantee he was on Tinder to even meet black girls. And then when we look at perhaps a lot of people are familiar with, the OkCupid dating website, and they have about 5 million members worldwide. And they did the race and attraction survey, which was done in, I believe, 2015 and repeated in 2018. And that's the survey, in essence, that I think a lot of us would have heard the narrative around sort of like pop culture, where they said that black women are at the bottom of the proverbial dating totem pole, meaning that black women statistically have the least favorable outcomes with online dating when it comes to if anybody responds to their contacts. And I'm sure like a lot of people have heard this around, they maybe just don't necessarily know that it came from a data science study. So in essence, proving that, and there was a whole ranking where I think white men had the best outcomes, followed by white women, and then there was sort of some other races, but I think it was black women and Asian men that were right at the bottom. And I think it's something even Issa Rae has sort of spoken about. So I was also understanding that, well, I was even statistically disadvantaged on the mainstream platforms. And I think the final sort of like, for me, the straw that broke the camel's back from my side, it was a date I went on, because I kind of got to the point where I was like, fine, I'm going to broaden my options. Let me not limit myself to just dating from within my race, as it's so difficult to meet people, and not just my race specifically, but even my culture, because, I'm aware that, for a lot of us, and this is, that it's more than race, black or white. Black is not a monolith. We have so many cultures and so many religions. So I was like, look, okay, rather than restrict myself to just Nigerians, let's just open it up. So I matched with a guy on Tinder. Can't remember, so I wouldn't say his name, but in terms of like his ethnicity, his heritage, so he was like British, white, I believe maybe his grandparents were Italian, but, by all means, he was just, sort of a British guy. And so we matched and we were talking for about 2 weeks. And he was very, very keen to take it offline and meet up, which I always advise, I think, is a good thing in online dating, where, you want to take it offline as soon as you're comfortable to see what's happening in real world interaction. So just kind of, where you stand. So we arranged to meet up after work, I recall. And he had told me he worked in finance, in merger and acquisitions, which is it's a very hectic, intense, timely, project-based job. So when I got to the restaurant, he was there before me, and it was a restaurant bar. He was standing outside, and he was on a work call. And so he saw me as I approached. He continued, taking his work call, and I remember he was, how sort of like finance people talk on the phone, and he was like, yes, we're going to make this transaction for X million, and don't worry, everything will be fine. And it was kind of intense into what he was doing. So he waved at me, and he he mouthed, so meaning he made the signs. He moved his lips, but words didn't come out. So I kind of lip read him because he was on the work call, and he gestured and he said, just go inside, I'll see you inside when I finish my work call. So that was totally fine with me. I mean, he did.
Oh, you're okay with it? Okay.
I was totally okay. I was like, do you know what? First of all, he was there on time. I was 5 minutes late. He was standing outside, and I totally get, like, work is work, and especially when you're an employee, worker bee. So I was like, fine, finish what you need to do. So I went inside the venue, and it was a restaurant stroke bar, which I specifically chose because for dates, I like the option where you can start at the bar and then there isn't that pressure to have a dinner, because dinner can be quite a big commitment from a time perspective if you're not getting along. And also sometimes, depending on whether you go Dutch or the man pays, a lot of men default to paying, and dating gets very expensive because they're always paying for lots of dinners. So I just sat up at the bar with my back was facing the entrance, thinking, okay, we'll start off at the bar and just see where this goes. So I kind of saw him at the corner of my eye. He must have finished his work call, and he walked inside the restaurant. He scanned the room to look for me, and he saw another black girl sitting in the restaurant, and he went to sit opposite her.
No.
Yes, he did.
Oh my gosh.
Now, this girl had a different build to me. She had a different complexion to me. Her hair was different. It wasn't even as if like we had no similarities. He sat there for a few seconds, I suppose, until he read the expression on her face. And he scanned the room again and he saw me, and so he kind of rushed over and he sat with me.
Oh my goodness.
Yes.
How did you feel?
God, it was so good. I was indignant, frustrated, and I was embarrassed for him. And I think I was disappointed as well, because it so naturally uncovered a lot of the things that, are perhaps unsaid in terms of it. It really showed to me that he didn't see me as an individual. He saw my race first. He saw my ethnicity first. And it also showed me he was, and, there are some people like that. He was that person that clearly has difficulty distinguishing between people of another race, which to me is like it's super unattractive. So, and I'm sure we've all had those maybe office situations, right, where sometimes we'll keep on getting called the name of a colleague that we share the ethnicity with, even though, we don't sort of look like each other, or, it used to happen maybe in education. But yeah, I wasn't expecting it on a date. And I was like, he just saw me outside. He just saw me.
Seriously.
So, yes. So for me, that was the final straw. I deleted Tinder. I got off Tinder. And I was like, there has to be a better experience for Black people, and particularly from a cultural perspective, for people who are connected to their heritage, whether it's African or Caribbean or Afro Latina, Afro Brazilian. I'm like, it has to be better, and that was the moment where I knew I had to create something.
Wow. I mean, sorry about that
Yeah.
experience, and I'm sure lots of Black women or just women of color have experienced things similar to that. So that's, I can't imagine.
Micro, yes, microaggressions, and I wasn't familiar with the word microaggression at the time, so maybe that was even harder because you kind of don't have a name for it. But at
Mm.
least now I know it was a microaggression.
Ugh, oh my gosh. And so that's why Africlick exists and needs
Yeah.
to exist. Yeah, to at least lower some of those issues that you'd run into trying to maybe date people that are outside of your culture.
Yes, because I believe on Africlick as well. We don't stop anyone joining, so everyone is welcome officially, regardless of their ethnicity. But what we ask is that you appreciate and respect the culture rather than fetishizing and perhaps just seeing, blackness and stereotyping certain traits.
Mm. Wow. Okay. I mean, that's good to know. I think that was going to be one of my questions. Like, how do you, like, bar non, non-black people, or how do you like kind of verify people's like actual ethnicity or background?
Yes, so it is totally um, open to all because then of course there are also white Africans as as well, but it's open to everyone, and yeah, and it's really about the so as long as they appreciate the culture and what we've seen, like because currently now Africlick is in a beta phase at the moment, so we're in beta on the Android store and then through iOS on test flight, and what we're seeing is even when, because I remember one of our, we had I think I was doing a talk at Google for Startups in London, and it was a Turkish guy, and he was really interested, and he was signing up for the app, and he was testing it, and then at several stages in the sign up process, he came to me with questions. So we, at one point during the sign up, we asked the user for their sickle cell genotype. Now, of course, a lot of us are familiar. Sickle cell is if you're African, I believe it's a 28% chance that you may be a healthy carrier of the sickle cell trait,
Oh, wow.
which would then be, yes, which of course, in sickle cell is for those who may not know, it's a hereditary blood disorder for which there isn't a cure. So for anyone who is born and maybe has full sickle cell, it's a very difficult, very sort of painful life that they would have. So it's something that we have to be conscious of, at least when we're choosing a partner, if we have the intention to start a family. So during the sign up process, and what we do with Africlick as well is we don't publish the sickle cell genotype because we think it's sensitive information, but the algorithm in the back end can take it into account, just so we can kind of like begin to have that conversation. So going back to this lovely Turkish guy, when we were at Google for Startups in London, he was testing the app, and he came to me with the screen, and he was like, "Oh, what do I do with this? I don't know what this is." And there's an option when you sign up to say, "I don't know,"
Mm-hmm.
but it was perhaps a signal or a hurdle for maybe somebody who wasn't within the culture. And then also, we have a section when you build your profile where you can select your hobbies and interests. Now, what I love about the section is I found when I was signing up for maybe other dating apps, I wasn't really fully able to express the cultural aspects of my interests
Mm.
through those apps. So, like for Africlick, for example, when you choose the music you like, we have options for things like, I think, Afrobeat and soca, when you choose what type of traveler you are, you can say things like, well, I'm a backpacker, or I'm a city traveler, or I'm a luxury traveler. We ask, we have things like jollof rice, the type of drinks that we like to drink. And, and he was puzzled about all of these things. He didn't really know this month sign up. And I'm like, so they're also subtle signals, meaning, like for example, and sometimes those things, it can be to do with your ethnicity or your skin color, but sometimes it's also the culture. It's perfectly feasible that you could be a non-black person, but if you're very kind of attached to uh, maybe your particular area of Africa that you like, you will know a lot of these things. You can, if you see Nollywood as an option, you're going to be like, yeah, I'm into Nollywood movies or Gollywood or whatever your thing might be.
That's so cool. Wow. And so before I ask a few more questions about Africlick, I would like to maybe get to know more about your story. So you said you're Nigerian. So were you born in Nigeria or were you born in London? And what was your experience just growing up?
So I was born in London and grew up for first part of my life in London, then moved to Nigeria for a few years, and then moved back to London. So I actually consider I was very lucky in that aspect, uh, particularly, and I think I even mean, well, lucky, I think, to experience dual cultures firsthand. And particularly, I think when growing up I think particularly when I moved to Nigeria, it was definitely an awakening of self. And it was the first time, growing up in London, I also grew up in a very white area. So for example, in the both my nursery school and my primary school, there was only one other black family, like in both experiences. So, that means growing up, I wouldn't say it was not racism. And of course, then you're very young, right? When you're 4, 5, 6 years old. Uh, if a kid, I would be asked questions like, oh, why is your hair like that? Why is your skin like that? And it was by no means hostile. They were just genuine questions, because for the majority of my friends at school that I grew up with, I was the first black person they had like come into contact with. So, so you're feeling a little bit like I don't know, like on display or like an exhibit. And I definitely recall living in Nigeria, sort of, it was an amazing experience. I would say that. Granted, initially when I moved there, I didn't quite fit in because I was too British. And I remember I started at primary school, and the school decided that because I was coming from the UK, they said they should put me in 1 year ahead.
Oh, wow.
Yes, and then I don't know how much if you schooled much, like at least in Nigeria, there's something called double promotion, and they're very casual. So what it means is if you're in primary school and if you're smart, they will let you skip a year and go ahead. And they call it, oh, so you had a double promotion. Whereas I know in like the UK schooling system, like it's not like that. However smart you are, you do every year. Which I think there is benefit in that, right? Because it's not just about the academic that you're learning, you're kind of growing as a person. So they decided, oh yeah, she's coming from the UK. We're going to put her in a year ahead because of course the UK is so much more behind. So what I found when I got into the new class was I was good on every subject, but my maths and it wasn't behind, right? Because they had put me a year ahead, but I couldn't keep up with the maths. And I guess with maths being such a cornerstone, they then decided to move me back into the year I would be in for my age. So first of all, that was kind of humiliating, and everyone was laughing, like, "Oh, she thinks she's so clever. She's come from the UK. Ha 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 ha. She's already demoted." Even though I was demoted to the year I should have been in relative to my age. But it also showed, even in terms of the standards of education, at least in Nigeria at the time, it meant that, well, for Nigeria, we were ahead in maths.
Mm.
Uh, Granted, English and other subjects, maybe like on par, but maths was definitely ahead, and even definitely on reflection, I know that's why my maths is good today. I know that was partially why I chose to do a computer science degree. It was because the way maths was, for me, taught in Nigeria was, I don't know, it was just kind of like I understood the fundamentals more. And there wasn't this notion of, oh, maths is difficult. There wasn't this notion of maths and sciences for boys. Like, everyone sort of across the genders kind of got in there. But I mean, I would also say the experience of living in Nigeria, where I was part of the majority ethnically and not the minority,
Mm.
was definitely transformational and life changing. So seeing policemen, politicians, teachers, everyone, where everyone looks like you. So there isn't a notion of there wasn't a notion of me being black. It was more about culture. So it would be me saying, well, Dayo is Yoruba, or maybe my mum who happens to be Edo. People identified based on uh, their their tribe,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to black. And I feel very fortunate to have had that experience in a way, perhaps a bit of a decolonization.
Oh, I'm
Uh,
sure. Yeah.
yeah, and I would also say, even from a child, from a child's perspective, growing up in London was great culturally, because every weekend there we would go to museums, we would go to children's theatre, and like act and learn a play. Well, we'll go and do art stuff. Growing up in London, definitely from a cultural exposure perspective, it was great. But Nigeria was just, there wasn't that kind of culture, but it was just so much more fun because the weather was hot every day. We had a pool, and unlike in London, where maybe if you had like a play date, the parents would call each other and arrange and text, and there'd be all this. It was such a drama to share, where and then the parents would ask, oh, what does she like to eat, and then we would make sure we had like the food for them and stuff. And in Nigeria, we would just drop in on people. Like, it wasn't like we set something up. We would just be in the car, like, okay, let's go and see this person, and you would just turn up, have fun, play, do you know what I mean, like run around outside. And yeah, it was amazing, I would say that.
Wow. And so when did you go back to London? Was it for college?
Mm. So college, just to check if I'm using the right terminology, I think so. That's what we call secondary school. So I was about 11, 12 when I came back to London.
Ah, okay. So I think, yeah, by college I meant like university, like
Oh,
after grade
okay.
12. Uh-huh.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, no, no, I came back earlier than
Okay.
that. Yeah, so about age 11, and then I would still visit like a few times a year and stuff, which I still do.
Very cool. And so after working, you said, as a consultant, like at what point did you realize like, okay, I can actually do this?
So it was a it was a gradual thing. Initially, I started at Accenture, then I moved on to Deloitte and Touche Tomahatsu, as they are called, and I was enjoying. I think the thing with consulting is that it's everything is, as a consultant, it's all project based. So no 2 days are the same, and we're working on projects for different clients for maybe months, maybe even years at a time. So I had the opportunity to work across different industry sectors. I was primarily looking at working in financial services and IT strategy. And so I was able to even begin to think, okay, I spent some time working in the defense sector. I was like, okay, I don't really like defense. It's a bit boring. I quite like financial services. Then I would also get to work in different cities, whether it was around the UK or sometimes Europe, also North America and India. So I was able to be like, okay, well, I quite like this city. I liked working in India. So I guess I was always paying attention to the projects I liked and the clients I liked to try and do more of what I liked. And then eventually I realized that the consulting projects I enjoyed the most were the projects where I was able to join at the inception when we were shaping the strategy, and then see it all the way through, or as much as possible, to uh, the conclusion, or when we would roll off. Whereas when I would join a project, perhaps halfway through, where all of the decisions in terms of like the initial decisions of what strategy are we going to use to solve this problem, the decisions had been made, I didn't enjoy this project as much. And I began to realize that I needed to, it was very important for me when solving a problem to have buy-in at the idea stage. What are we going to build? How are we going to solve this? And that's when I was more engaged. That's when I would perform better. That's when I would get better performance reviews. Then I also began to realize that the more, dare I say, control or influence I had over the project or the program, the happier I was. So that was what led me to know the best thing for me was to create my own thing. I was moving towards what I enjoyed the most, and ironically, what was the least stressful for me. For me, it is more stressful to be in the back seats. I'm happiest when I'm driving. Obviously, figuratively.
Wow, that's so interesting. And so, what's been your experience? I'm curious, like fundraising for Africlick, because I know, well, in the U.S., Black women get like, I think it's like 0.5% of all like investment dollars, and
Yeah,
so I can imagine that that's similar around the world. So I'm
it's not
curious.
worse. I agree. Yeah, the trend, if not worse, uh, around the world. When I say worse, like the statistic is smaller because America is more advanced, and I believe the statistic is possibly even smaller within Africa as well. Like actually on the continent for African startups.
Wow.
And I mean, I would say, in terms of my experience fundraising, say as a female founder. So right now with Africlick, we are okay. So right, let's start from the beginning. In terms of how Africlick has been funded to date, so this is like to get us into beta within the App Store and have sort of early traction and engagement, and people who have several people who have pre-signed up to the app. So initially, the first tranche of funding, I I decided to do an MSc, a Masters of Science in Technology Entrepreneurship, and I did it at University College London. And I chose that master specifically because I wanted to learn more about the management of high growth tech and lean startup. And University College London is very good at entrepreneurship. So while I was at the university, there's loads of like startup competitions or sort of mini accelerator programs where you can win, where you can get money at the end for your startup. So while I was there part time over 2 years, I entered and won three different competitions, either one or I was a runner up. And I got what they call like grant money. Grant meaning it's equity free, so I didn't have to give up any equity in Africlick, and was able to get some basically some financing, which is what I used initially. So in terms of that first experience, fundraising as a woman founder, what will I say? I mean, because of course I have to look at, I would say that I was when pitching, the disadvantage for me was that I would be pitching the idea of Africlick to sometimes often an all white panel, which meant that I had to explain. The questions I would get was, well, why do African people need anything different? Why do Black people need anything different? So they had no cultural understanding. Whereas perhaps if I was pitching a product that was for white people or British people, I didn't have to spend the first minute of my 5-minute pitch explaining like the baseline. So so that was definitely a disadvantage. And I very quickly had to find, and I had some, great support from the UCL Innovation and Enterprise, and I used comparators to very quickly kind of explain. So, for example, I would say things like, well, there's a product called JDate, which is dating for Jewish people. There's a product called Shadi.com, which is dating for Indian people, but there is a gap in the market as far as African people. So I was able to make the case by way of comparators, whereas I find when I'm speaking to Africlick and having fundraising conversations with people who are African, I don't need to explain this because they already typically either have children or they have friends or relatives who are struggling in terms of dating and meeting people from their culture. So, but at the same time, I was able to be successful there a number of times, but I would definitely say that, well, yeah, I did have to, where we say there's this thing of, for us as ethnic minorities, do we have to try harder than our mainstream counterparts to get the same result? And definitely I had to explain more in my pitches. And I can remember there was one particular pitch competition where I came out as a runner-up. And I think I recall the startup that won. They were building technology for irritable bowel syndrome. And one of the judges said when he was giving feedback, I've lived with irritable bowel syndrome all of my life, so I know exactly how bad this is. And I thought, okay, you're definitely at an advantage if the judging panel can directly relate to the pain that you are solving. So I think there's definitely something, and perhaps particularly in the UK, where if you are, first of all, female founder, ethnic minority female founder, and then the product, the customer segment I'm building for is an ethnic minority segment. That's 3 sets of barriers to overcome.
Man, I can imagine, because then to the panel or evaluators, they're like, oh, this isn't a problem, because obviously they can't relate to it or they know nothing about it.
Yes, and to your point, literally how you phrased it, this isn't a problem. So sometimes there's this notion of if an individual making a fundraising decision, if they come from a majority group, not a minority, then it's your reliance on that individual having, whether it's the humility or the vision to say, well, I am not part of this minority group, but I can't just dismiss their experience. Maybe I need to go ask, okay, well, what research have you done? How many people have you asked? So, it's the same way for me, if somebody from another intersection of diversity says that they're building something, perhaps whether it is disability or LGBTQ, I know it's not for me as an individual to say, oh, that's not a problem, because I'm not from that group. I couldn't possibly know. All I can ask you to do is bring the data from that group to support what you're saying, which is more of the I think the approach that we need to see. So I mean, I would say my experience for when I was at university, it was good. Like, I was able to go in and be successful, but I would definitely I think I did have to perform at a very high level and do a lot of explaining, and that sort of grant money, early, sort of early stages, taken us through to where we are today. And then right now we are raising a bigger round of investment for Africlick, which is, kind of like the next hurdle. We're early on in the process. So I'm saying now it's almost too early for me to know how the experience is going to be. But so far, there've been very encouraging conversations. And what I'm doing is having conversations with also African investors as well. So people who are already kind of bought into the culture and could see themselves using the product, and they're very excited about it.
That's so cool. And have you looked into some like US based funds? Like I'm thinking like Backstage Capital. Like I know they're very focused on like, supporting like minority and like LGBT founders, and like Harlem Capital, things like that. Like have you looked into US based ones?
So I haven't yet, but I have seen the news recently, and this is particularly Harlem Capital, that they've just raised a big fund, I believe. It's at about 40 million
Yeah.
US dollars. And of course, there's Afro Tech, Latin America, that's what it's called, the tech festival the tech conference that happens. So,
Yes.
so America may definitely be on the cards. And I think it's going to be an interesting journey to see. So with me now looking first, of course, to the UK where I'm based, and then looking to Nigeria. But if this is something that may fly better, um, in through the US as well, and I'm totally open to that.
Very cool. And so I know you said it's currently in beta. So for people that are curious or want to be like notified once it's like available in their city, do they just go to the website then and just submit their email?
Literally, absolutely that. So if you go to africlick.com, that's africlick.com, you can submit your email to pre-register for the app. If you have an Android phone, then you can even go straight to the Play Store and search for Africlick, and you will see we are listed there under early release. So what that means is you can download the early version, and if you wish, give us some feedback. There's still time to sort of integrate changes in. And then for those who maybe perhaps are more social media based, we're also on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, and we are at Africlick on all of those platforms.
Awesome. I will make sure to include that in all of the show notes. So, just real quick before we kind of wrap things up, what would you say excites you about Africa's future? And what advice do you have for, let's say, young people across the diaspora looking to do something similar to you, or just do something to kind of, impact their community or make some sort of difference?
Okay, so I think what makes me most excited about Africa, I think, and I'm not sure whether I'll. This is something I heard Bill Gates said on his visit to Nigeria. I'm not sure whether it's true or not, but Bill Gates supposedly said that he said, "Oh, that Nigeria is underutilizing its most valuable asset." To which somebody responded and said, "Oh, what, the oil?" And he said, "No, the people." And what excites me, I think, the most about Africa, I mean, we're a little bit over 1 billion in population. It's also a very young population, with almost the majority being under age 21. And I think we're such smart, capable people. When we look at the conditions under which people are surviving, and in some cases thriving, where the basics, in some cases, like even water and electricity, people have to, like Maslow's, if I look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that there's still so many things in the hierarchy that the majority of people are facing, but yet we're still showing so much innovation. And I think what really excites me, particularly for me as somebody who's like a technologist and has worked in technology, and I think we have massive potential for how technology can upskill. We're already skilled, but further skill our population. From when I worked, from the short time that I worked out in India, in Hyderabad, and I visited India several times, I'm still just so inspired in terms of how this is a nation that has literally probably hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of technologists who are not just serving the Indian economy, but are the backbone of global American firms. So, for example, pretty much take any of the major American banks, they are employing thousands of people in India. And I look at, for example, somewhere like, well, it could be Nigeria, it could be Kenya. I'm like, well, our time difference, we're close to GMT zero. We're in the middle of the world, which is great for global services because the time fits. The majority of us speak English and speak English very well. And yeah, I can't wait. And I know Andela has begun to make strides in that area, but I'm very excited about tapping into that. And I think that also then can remove dependence on government. And, there's this notion of more Africans being able to make a living and earn money. And as long as they can have a internet connection, they can just kind of like deploy their technology skills.
Wow, I love that so much. Wow. And any last advice for young people across the diaspora who are looking to do something similar to you or just start something?
So I would say my advice would be to spend a lot of time at the ideation and the idea validation stage. Try and be unbiased and follow the lean startup method to collect as much validation as possible that your concept is really needed, because ultimately for anything I suppose to be sustainable, you at least want a minimum number of people who are interested and who require uh, your solution. Try not just to do a copy paste and be another dot 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 or something. So I would give that advice, and also be resolute. Once you've decided this is what you're building, uh, be resolute in what you want to do. Don't allow external people to project perhaps their doubts or their fears or tell you all the reasons why it's not going to work. Don't allow that to happen, because in that case you'll never get started. If I had listened to the majority advice I had been given, I wouldn't be building Africlick, because there will always be a lot of, and sometimes they're naysayers, sometimes they're just concerned people, and they will think of all the reasons why something can't work. But then I'm like, well, that's business and innovation. Of course, if there weren't barriers, then so many more things would exist. And in creating something and solving all of those barriers, that's how equity and value gets built into a business and gets built into a brand. So, yes, that would be the advice I would give.
That is so great. Thank you so much for that. I completely agree that, you know, if you rely on people's input, obviously you want people's feedback and things like that to make sure that your idea is actually solid. But then if you want too much of that, it could actually hinder you and, just stop you from actually starting something. So I appreciate that advice, and I'm sure the listeners will as well.
And a great thing I would build on, just to build on what you said in terms of how to evaluate feedback. And I think a great way to sometimes sort of classify feedback, always look at, is the feedback coming from your target customer? Because oftentimes people will give feedback and they're not the target customer. So for example, I'll get a lot of feedback from parents telling me, maybe parents perhaps maybe age about maybe 55, and they'll be telling me this is how Africlick should work. Or they'll be telling me why it won't work. And I now just learn to filter it, because ultimately you're not the target market. So that can often be a good way to say also, build your product for your users. As long as your users are telling you, this is what we want, this is what we're going to use, then you're on the right track.
Wow. Thank you so much for that. And thank you for being a guest. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Okay, great. No, it's been a real pleasure, and thank you so much for having me as well.
So what did y'all think? I think Africlick is such a great idea, and I can't wait for it to be everywhere and just exist in all the cities around the world. So don't forget, you can go to africlick.com and pre-register for the app, and also share this with a friend. If you know someone that's tired of swiping left on your traditional dating apps because they just can't find someone that is right for them, or they're looking to network with people just from the culture, go ahead and share this episode with them. And again, you can visit deardiasporashow.com to learn more, or look at the show notes for the links to Africlick and all of Dear Diaspora social media. Thanks for listening to Dear Diaspora. If you like what you hear, subscribe, rate, and review us on iTunes. You can find us on Instagram at Dear Diaspora, or visit our website at deardiasporashow.com. Thank you, and talk to you next week.